Welcome to Refugee Radio.
I'm Ayah and this is Refugee Radio. Today we've got Steve and Kate Jessop. Welcome.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure, my name's Kate. I'm an immigration solicitor, although nowadays I only do asylum law as I'm a legal aid lawyer. I work at Brighton Housing Trust in the immigration department, and I've been there since 2001. So quite a long time, the longest I've ever been in a job. We just do legal aid law, and I work with 4 other caseworkers.
And what exactly does your job entail?
Well, unfortunately we only do legal aid work these days, which has been limited in scope. So mostly our clients are asylum seekers, the majority of whom are unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. We take on their cases right from the beginning when they first arrive here. The majority of them are referred by the social services to us, and we help them in submitting their applications for asylum, accompanying them to their interviews, representing them, trying to assist them in how best to present their cases. And if they're refused, which many of them are sadly, we represent them at appeal. And then in the event that that's refused, we take the cases right up to the highest court in the land.
And typically, what's like the average time that a case might take when you're working with refugees or asylum seekers?
Well, I mean, that's one of the big scandals of the Home Office today, the delay problem. For a long time, the Home Office said that they would try and look at unaccompanied asylum-seeking children within 6 months, but that's long gone by the board. So sadly, although some youngsters get processed within a year, a lot of them can wait for 3 to 4 years, and adult asylum seekers can wait for even longer. And it's quite difficult to challenge delay, unfortunately. It's inbuilt into the process now.
Was that always the case, or...?
Yes, it's always been a problem. Delay has always been a problem, and every now and again the way the Home Office work is that they kind of reinvent the wheel constantly, and they bring in new procedures to try and speed things up. And when they bring them in, everybody that's been waiting before that then gets delayed further. So there are kind of tiers of people who've been delayed and delayed and delayed, and there are some people who've been waiting for, literally 14 years, although I don't have any clients like that. But there are some, it's inbuilt into the system, delay, unfortunately.
And you mentioned that you've been practicing since 2001. What are the most significant changes to the system or your work that you've witnessed?
Well, I've been practicing here since 2001, but I've actually been working in asylum and immigration law since 19, since the last century, since 1987, so for a long time. And there have been numerous changes, a few for the better, but mostly for the worst. And one of the major, so on the legislative side of things have become more and more, it's become more and more difficult to argue people's cases. But it sort of goes hand in hand with what legal aid provides as well. So when I first started, legal aid was available for all forms of asylum, immigration, nationality. So we did a lot of family cases, whilst we did lots of refugee cases as well. I would say 50% of it was family cases, the kind of cases that you hear about now who are falling through the traps, the Windrush cases. And we got paid in 1987 £46 2030, we didn't get paid, but the legal aid agency paid £46.50, I think it was, an hour. Legal aid now pay £47.30 an hour. So that's from, I think it's 32 years. That's how much it's gone up. So in other words, it's gone down substantively. And the scope of legal aid has closed so that we can only represent refugees and people with a limited amount of people with domestic violence cases. So all those family cases and all the kind of people that we would have been able to help on who've been here for a long time, who've got family here, are now we would call them Article 8 cases, are all out of scope of legal aid, which is a massive disaster. So they don't get help, and that's one of the reasons why so many people got detained and removed in the inverted commas Windrush scandal.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the specifics of that criteria change and why now you're having to refuse a lot more people? People don't fall under the criteria that they might have done before.
Sure. So talking about, do you mean the scope of legal aid?
Yeah.
Yes. I think I'm right in saying it was at the beginning of 2013 that legal aid was called LASBO, the Act, and legal aid was cut in immigration for all immigration cases other than spouses who fall specifically under the immigration rules, whose marriages have broken down as a result of domestic violence, asylum seekers, Article 3 cases where there is a risk to life, and there are some, and also cases that we don't deal with which come under state security. The other cases that are eligible for legal aid are people who are applying for bail. But once bail is granted, if they're out of scope, that's the end of it. We can't help them. And everything else is out of scope.
What happens to those people that are out of scope?
Well, the government announced that there is an exceptional case application that can be made, but it's very time consuming. And very few people, very few practices who practice in legal aid actually have the time to take on the cases to make exceptional claims, and even when we do, quite a lot of them are refused. Thankfully, we've now got somebody who is doing that, but only in a very limited way, because it's quite time consuming. It also means that we have to spend money on interpreters that we might never get back, so it's a kind of catch-22. So they fall out of scope. And in Brighton, Brighton Voices in Exile will see some people, and that's about it. Everybody else has to try and find the money, or they just don't get legal representation.
And you mentioned that you were practising elsewhere before you came here. How was that different to how it is in Brighton? Are there any differences?
Well, apart from the change in law and the tightening up and restrictions in legal aid and in immigration law, it's interesting actually. I suppose the main difference is because we work with the local authority a lot. The local authority in Brighton and Hove, and to a certain extent West Sussex, but not quite so much anymore, are much more hands-on, not as much as they used to be. So when I came from London, having worked with boroughs like Newham, Redbridge and Islington, who all have a very negative attitude towards particularly unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, they say they don't, but they're desperate to prove that they're over 18 often. It was quite interesting to find that there was a much more generous attitude from the local authority here. But I think that's just in comparison with London. I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that Brighton is any better than any other small town where they haven't got as large a population.
So what do you think the factors to that attitude are? Why are the authorities in Brighton more hands-on than other places?
Well, I think to begin with it was the people that they employed. They have a much more positive attitude towards asylum seekers, and I'm now talking about asylum seekers because they are the majority of our clients. Whereas I don't necessarily think that the people that I dealt with in the local authorities in London were, had a negative attitude, but what they had was a system that they tried to get. It was an expensive system, and they did not want to have to take on responsibility for people. I don't know. I mean, I'm not answering that question very well. I can't speak for them.
Is it a cultural difference between the departments where London is trying to prove that people are over 18 so they don't have to support them, but in Brighton the culture is to be more accepting, to take the applicants on face value?
Yeah, I think. I mean,
services?
obviously it's difficult for me because I'm comparing London boroughs in 2001 with Brighton now, so things may have changed for the better, or the worse. I don't know. So it is a cultural thing, and also, it's also like so many things. The people who actually work in Brighton and Hove, and the person who now is in charge of the unaccompanied asylum seeking or the children's thing just happens to have a very good attitude. So.
Were they different people from different countries? I mean, in London as to Brighton.
Yeah, I think. Well, I didn't. When I was working in London, I had less unaccompanied asylum-seeking children as clients. But yes, there's a different demographic.
Yeah. What would you say is the demographic of Brighton? Where are people coming from to claim asylum and finding themselves here?
Well, I'm always terrified that I'm going to miss somebody out here. But bearing in mind that most of our clients are children, unfortunately we do sometimes have to turn away adults because we've only got 5 caseworkers, including myself. The majority of people, mostly, and also I can give you gender as well, Afghan boys, very, very rarely Afghan girls. Iraqi and Iranian boys, occasionally girls, Eritrean boys and girls. There's a large Sudanese, Egyptian, Syrian, Coptic community in Brighton, so we get quite a lot of adults from Sudan, Egypt, and Syria. Quite a lot of Copts, but not all. We get a lot of Sudanese clients now, mostly unaccompanied asylum-seeking children.
From Darfurian?
Mostly from Darfur, yeah.
Region, yeah.
Yeah, mostly who've been via Libya, and their journeys have taken forever, a long time, and also they've been through the most appalling situations while they've been in Libya. So often it can have taken them 2-3 years to get here.
Is that in connection with like the slave trade in Libya? Of young minors, is that you've had people that have been through those experiences or encountered those
I would
people?
say the majority of the young Sudanese Darfurians cross through. I mean, most of them come overland. Most of them go through Chad and then Libya, and in Libya they get stuck. And if they've either been in indentured labour, where they're working for nothing with a promise that eventually they will pay for the boat over to Europe. Some of them have been captured and tortured for money from families that they don't have. Quite a lot of the clients are covered in scars from tortures from Libya.
Oh, it's to extort.
Yes,
like
to
ransom.
Extort money, to try and extort money from family. It's you read about it. It happens.
Yeah.
And then so we get as I say, I think I've had one Sudanese Darfurian client who's got here in a different way, and it didn't take them very long, but all the others have been through this, and then quite a few of them have arrived on the axle of a lorry or a bus
from Calais.
Yeah.
Do those traumas and vulnerabilities, having that in mind, does that complicate your job?
Well, they do. I mean, they're obviously a huge part of the client's case, the trauma that they've been through. Do you mean the trauma that we suffer, we go through as listening to it?
I guess. I mean, yeah. How does it affect you?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, there is in legal aid lawyers who deal with this kind of work. kind of famously don't have any kind of support system, because there just isn't. It just doesn't. There isn't. Nobody can afford to do it. So it affects you in a, it does affect you. I don't really know what to say to that.
How do you manage then, like hearing these kind of stories?
Okay, so you manage by, obviously there's confidentiality, so you can't go home and talk to everybody about it. But so we talk to each other at work about it. I have attempted at one stage to find somebody to come and talk to us through that, but it's just very difficult to find anyone that actually works in this area and who would actually be able to kind of assist. So we just kind of deal with it, hopefully well. And hopefully that not in a way that kind of affects the clients, and hopefully not in a way that we all become case hardened and stop asking and stop listening.
How much of your time and mental space do you think it dominates?
90%.
What leaves the other 10% for?
Telly. Sleeping. No, it dominates a lot of time. It's a really interesting, privileged but stressful job. If you do it properly, which I think I and my colleagues do, because you're always kind of thinking about a better way of dealing with something and a better angle. Sometimes you hear things which are horrendous, and occasionally I find myself remembering it at sort of 10 o'clock at night and thinking, my God, I can't believe I haven't thought about this until now. So that's sort of in itself a bit worrying. But yeah, it dominates a lot of time, and it's very anxious, because people your clients are very anxious. They're often traumatised, and they're often treated very badly by the Home Office. And when they're refused, it's incredibly traumatic for them. We can't guarantee that we're going to win their appeal, and the end of the line cases are just awful. So we try to do our best that we never get to those ones, but they are just awful.
Does it happen often that you get to that scenario?
No, but it does happen. It sounds rather arrogant to say that we do win quite a high percentage of our appeals where things are refused, but if your client is unlucky and gets a judge that isn't sympathetic, and you just get trapped in that system, and where there's a kind of negative credibility assessment by a judge on a refused case, you then and they decide to disbelieve, it's very, very difficult then to challenge. We do challenge it, and hopefully we're successful in the end, but sometimes we're not.
The judges at the immigration tribunal, often the final arbiters in some of the more complex cases, we like to think of our judges as unbiased
arbitrators of the law.
Yes.
Yes.
In practice, is it a question of, oh dear, today you've got the hanging judge, you're going to lose your case? Do you think that the judges are looking at each case on a case by case on its merits, or is it a question that some of the judges are liberal and some of the judges are just anti-immigration and looking to refuse as many cases as possible?
Well, I'd like to say that they're all terribly fair, but there's no question that some judges have some judges are known as dismissers. And some judges are known as allowers, and there are more dismissers than allowers.
Right.
That's probably the best way I can answer that. I could say an awful lot more about it, but perhaps
it's not politic to do so. To continue, okay. If you're going to become,
well, I'm happy.
If you're going to become a High Court judge one day,
I'm never going to become a judge. I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But clients always say when there are certain groups of clients who kind of talk with each other, and when they get the language. They say it's a lottery, and you kind of say no. There's a fair practice and there's fair procedure, but actually it is a lottery.
Who you get on the day.
Who you get on the day.
And before they get to the judge, the first port of call is the immigration, the interview, the asylum interview
Yes.
at the Home Office with the immigration interviewing officer. Do you find that they fall down the same kind of split of allowers or dismissers, or do you find that they're wholly different kind of animal?
Well, it's as you probably know, there's no legal aid to represent adults at asylum interviews anymore, sadly. So we don't get to go to those, although we do listen to them because they're recorded. But I attend all the unaccompanied, or my clients' unaccompanied, children's interviews. And there's two stages. There's one to lodge your application, which is at the asylum intake interview, they're now called. They used to be called screening. There's a special section of the Home Office that deal with these. And the people who take the initial information are clerks. But there's a very negative. It's a unit that's specifically for children, and there's a really appalling culture there, in that they are not very kind, and they're rude, and they generally treat both clients and representatives and social workers pretty badly. When we get to the second stage, which is the interview, most interviewers have now been trained, and on the whole, they're not named. There's so many of them. There was a stage about 10 years ago where we knew exactly, there were 4 or 5 of them, and we knew who was going to interview, and you knew who were nice and who weren't. But now they've just got lots of different people, and they get people down from Newcastle and Glasgow, and they're often not the decision makers. But the quality is very mixed.
Mm.
Could you tell us a little bit more about like the typical behaviours of these people?
Well, in talking about the main interview, are we talking about the asylum intake interview unit that I was just talking about? It's just rude, not an answer. There is no luckily, the information that's taken and given at those interviews now is no longer as important as it used to be. But it's rudeness, it's lack of respect. Some of the interviews are reasonably okay, but it's not a good first introduction to these kids going there. Apart from anything else, they keep you waiting for about 5 or 6 hours until you've actually had your 10-minute interview and the client's had his photo or her photo taken. So it's rudeness.
Have you ever been mistaken for a client when you've attended the Home Office? And have you ever been treated the way, or spoken to the way they speak to your clients, and had a taste of that?
I'm a white middle-class woman with a reasonably received English accent, and as a result, no, I haven't. People have been rude to me, but I've never been mistaken for a client. But I've been with many social workers, appropriate adults who have. The only appropriate adults who were ever asked to show their passports are black appropriate adults, people of colour. It's overt. They're obliged to find out that everybody that's they're allowed to make sure that everybody who's attending an interview is the person they say they are, and that they're not subject to immigration control. And I suppose on the fair side, you could say that as I am a solicitor and I've got evidence of that, they just assume that I am here lawfully. But I have never seen a white foster carer being asked to show their passport or asked to explain whether or not they're here lawfully.
And this is the security guards and the various functionaries inside the building, and
this is the interviewing officers.
This is the interviewing officers, yeah.
And
nice.
I mean, what's usually the reaction of the clients to this kind of behaviour that they receive?
Well, on the whole, when the client goes to the Home Office, we take an interpreter with us, and usually English is not their first language, and luckily the only thing that protects them from what's going on is the fact that they don't understand how rude people are being. I mean, it's an interesting one because earlier on Steve asked me if anyone had ever been rude to me, and when I was younger I was much more combative in interviews. When people used to be more overtly rude. When interviews used to be conducted by immigration officers in ports or in enforcement units. So those kind of career immigration officers who went into the force in order to get as many people out of the country as possible were untrained, and they were giving interviews, and they were quite hostile, very hostile to the client. They questioned them in a much more hostile way. Whereas now there's a kind of a certain amount of training that's gone on, so their clients will not automatically be they won't be shouted at, and they'll be given there's a very sort of standard procedure for each interview. So I just, in the past, when I've engaged in an argument with an immigration officer during a client's interview when they can't speak English, it's very, very upsetting for them. And they've been upset by my behaviour as well. All they can see is two people having an argument in a language that they don't understand, so it's very upsetting. But now the interviews are slightly better in that we're allowed breaks, which we take and we have, and we can explain during the break what's gone on and whether there's been a problem, and so they're slightly less confrontational. But they are incredibly rigorous. I mean, you can have a child whose interview goes on for 4 or 5 hours, ask the same questions over and over again. There's no kind of back off for questions about traumatic things that have happened to them. I once had a young person who was had been in the most appalling situation. Most of her family had been killed, and she was describing what had happened, and that they'd been killed with a gun, and the interpreter couldn't think of the word for gun, and so said, "Do you mean one of these?" Sorry, I've just pointed my finger in a gun fashion at the client. That's the kind of, and nothing was picked up. I mean, I complained, but that's the kind of insensitivity that can happen at some of these interviews.
So,
I think I'm rambling.
No,
not at all.
So you mentioned you work in tandem with other people, such as interpreters.
Yes.
How vital is that to your role?
Well, completely vital. We always insist. We always insist on having an independent interpreter. If the client, my question is normally, what language do you dream in? And if people have some English, if they don't dream in it, then they need an interpreter, because it's just so vital that everything is precise, because the Home Office's refusals are so often based on the tiniest little inaccuracy or contradiction. That can be enough to say we don't believe you, because most people arrive with no evidence. They don't have any evidence of who they are, where they come from, and they certainly don't have any evidence of what's happened to them, so everything is on what they have to say. And so consistency is all. And the Home Office uses the slightest contradiction as a reason for refusal and disbelief.
So really, the accuracy of the client's history is completely dependent on the professionalism of the interpreter.
Yeah. Hopefully, and our professionalism.
Of course.
I mean, it does take. We're all quite experienced about who we choose to be, and it's quite clear when the interpreter isn't actually interpreting literally. I say that having, I've used interpreters for Arabic-speaking Darfurians, and I've used Sudanese Arabic speakers from North Sudan, and I think I've got really good instructions. And then I've used a Darfurian Arabic speaker on the same interpreter, and there's just on the same client, and there's just so much more. So it's so easy to make mistakes and think you're getting the gist of what's happening.
So what other, besides interpreters and the local authorities, what other bodies do you work with?
Well, the Home Office, all the time. It's quite interesting being an asylum lawyer because you really only have one opponent. That's it, the Home Office. And then when you get into the higher courts, you have their lawyers. That's the only time you sort of deal with lawyers, when you get into the higher courts. The social services, as you've mentioned already, the legal aid agency, who take up an enormous amount of our time, challenging what we say, what our bills, and the amount of time we've spent. And they're being cut constantly, and so they try and cut back on what we fund ourselves at Brighton Housing Trust through legal aid, but we also get a lot of support from the senior, the other parts of Brighton Housing Trust. So many legal aid but immigration firms have closed down because they just can't survive on legal aid alone, and we don't do any other kind of work. So they take up a lot of our time. Other agencies, obviously the National Health, the Health Service, lots of GPs. We use a lot of experts. We use
such as what kind of experts?
Well, we use, on the whole, we would use for medical, psychiatric reports, country expert reports.
Linguistic analysts? Maybe?
Yes. Yeah. When there's a question of over somebody's nationality, so the Home Office will produce a Sprachab report saying we don't believe this person. For example, the classic is that a lot of Iranians are believed to be Iraqi, a lot of Syrians are thought to be Egyptians, and their applications are refused on that basis, so we challenge that with a linguistic expert, almost always successfully, because of the quality of the language reports. I've probably forgotten a few things, but
that's all right. Just to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned earlier that it's a privilege to do your job, and if correctly practiced, it can produce really rewarding outcomes. My question is then, what are those correct practices, and how can the incorrect practices cause, unfavourable outcomes?
Well, I suppose, we've just talked about the use of interpreters, and so that is incredibly important, because I would say, I can't give you a percentage, but the majority of our clients need interpreters. So that's number one, very important. But the other is the amount of time that we can spend on a case. And ever since the legal aid agency have cut back on stuff, and I'm talking only about legal aid work now, because private practice work is kind of out of the domain of most of our clients. They wouldn't be able to afford to pay for it. They've also introduced what they call a graduated fee scheme, so that there is a limited amount of time that you can spend on a case, unless you... So they give you a fixed fee, and you can only claim what you actually do on a case if you go to 3 times that. So if you spend 3 times the amount of the fixed fee. Do you want me to explain it? Because
yes,
you look like you're blank out. Okay, so the fixed fee for an adult asylum claim is £415. So that's what you get, even if you do. So that would work out as about 8 hours work. But nobody. So some bad practice people will try and do a claim within that time or less, so that I say bad practice, but I would consider bad practice to limit the amount of time you spend on a claim so that you don't lose money, because the majority of those cases would take a lot longer than that, but you won't get paid for anything over the 400 and whatever it is pounds. unless you go to so much that you've done 3 times the amount. So let's, for the sake of it, let's say it's 8 hours. So you'd have to do 24 hours on a case to actually get paid what you've actually done, which rarely happens on a first-time asylum claim. So good practice is to try and ignore that, and you spend as much time as it takes on a case. And we at BHT, we actually have got the luxury of being able to do that because we get a certain amount of support from Brighton Housing Trust, whereas in private practice they wouldn't. So they're almost pushed into potential bad practice. I'm not suggesting that all private practice firms are bad practice, but that there's an incentive to be quick and not take the time. The same again for bad practice in that people don't bother to apply for the money to get reports when they're needed. There's a whole raft of things about good practice, and perhaps my inability to answer says a lot. I've gone a bit blank.
And a lot of it is about helping the client to construct the correct story, or to present their story in the correct structure that the Home Office will understand and recognise as an asylum claim. And part of that is making sure that the client is prepared to actually talk about the awful things that have happened to them and disclose that on the initial application. And whereas some of the bad practice firms would be looking to just skim the surface and do it as quickly as possible, I kind of see your role more as like a deep sea diver.
Well, you've answered that question much better than I have. So you should be doing it. But you're quite right. But I also think that there's, particularly when you're dealing with youngsters, there is a propensity to, clients often tell you, so for an example, a child from Afghanistan, he's probably spent anything from a year to 2.5 years travelling overland to get here. Will have met agents, they'll have met other youngsters, they'll all have advice and stories and don't say this, do say that. So there's so much unravelling to do when somebody first arrives. And a perfect example is that it used to be until 2014, I think, if a child had been fingerprinted and claimed asylum in a third country, then they could be returned. And that story still goes around. So the classic would be to pretend they haven't been fingerprinted, but it will out. And so there's an awful lot of a need to gain trust, and also not to be judgmental when you get told something that somebody has just been scared into telling you. And I think it's an unravelling and unpicking without being judgmental, and not getting cross with your client if they have told you something, and making it easy for them to come back and say, actually, can I tell you something else, please? But it doesn't always work. Sometimes, hopefully the majority of people you do gain the trust to, but occasionally, people continue to be scared.
And you mentioned that that the Home Office is looking for the tiniest inconsistency to reject these claims, but it's only natural for human nature. It's memory and certain circumstances that people go through in their previous countries that can, and just the nature of storytelling can make your job a lot harder. What do you do when you encounter these inconsistencies from your client telling their story to you? I'm sure you can anticipate, this is going to be a problem for us. So how do you go about that?
Well, I think that when you first meet a client, it's about trying to give them as much information as possible about what they're going to go through. And so you can't overload them with info. And it's tactical as to when you start talking about why it's so important for everything to be consistent and why it's so important. And so, you know, you tell people gradually so that they understand it. Otherwise, it's completely and utterly overwhelming. There are always inconsistencies in storytelling. I mean, I always take it from when I first started here. My nephew was 16. He couldn't remember what he did the day before. And he was living in a very nice middle-class life with no problems at all. I'm sure he would dispute that, but you know, so that the actual ability to recall, and also, you know, an ability to recall when you didn't know that you would have to remember it, particularly from cultures that don't use dates in the same that we do, and that whole kind of narrative that is as a sort of very Western European trait, and that we're obsessed with dates and times here, which is completely and utterly alien to lots of people. So it's really, you know, that it's gradually letting them know what they're going to come up against. And normally, when they get their full interview, it will probably be 6 months after I first met them. So there's time to kind of get them used to the idea of what's going to happen.
And that's really interesting that you mentioned that the chronological and date-accurate nature of storytelling here in the UK might be foreign to people from other countries. Are there other examples of those kind of complexities that you faced which you thought, I never thought to consider that, you know, other people might think about dates differently, or what other examples of that are there?
Well, that's one of the major things about, and also just the, this is awful, because I'm going to kick myself later because there are so many examples and I can't think of a single one now.
That's all right.
But can we come back to that?
Yeah, of course.
I was going to ask about when you started this sort of work. Why did you end up doing immigration? Presumably you studied law and then decided, I'm going to go and do law now. Why did you decide to do immigration and asylum or human rights law?
It was actually the other way around.
Okay.
I became interested, well, I was always interested in kind of race and immigration issues, and then I started working in that area, and I started working for an MP actually, who was the shadow spokesman for race and immigration, and I kind of got much more knowledgeable and interested, and then I got a job in a law centre unqualified.
And was it initially the race that was the issue for you? Was it you were concerned about political issues of racism, and then that led into thinking about immigration as a kind of related issue? Yes,
it was. Yeah. I mean, although obviously, I say obviously, I hate that word, I keep using it. Though immigration was something that I had considered, I had never really embraced it until I started working for in the House of Commons, and that was the brief, and I became fascinated by it and the kind of racism in our legislation, and then I kind of decided that I wanted to be an advisor, and then once having been an advisor, I thought it'd be better if I became qualified. So that's how it worked that way.
I suppose immigration is where the government does racism in policy terms, whereas of course there's people might identify racism in policing or something, but actually immigration rules are inherently
they're
racist.
Inherently
they
racist.
Cannot avoid
exactly.
the fact that they're discriminating
exactly. Whereas
something.
You know, as you say, police guidelines and whatever are, you know, they may look good, but they don't. Remember when I worked in Battersea, there was a poster up years ago for somebody who was wanted for a smash, you know, a crime, and they just I don't know whether I should say this actually, but they'd stuck a picture of Nigel Benn, the boxer, up and put a hat on, and they'd actually used Nigel Benn's photograph. This was, I mean, we're going back to kind of 1980.
Like the identikit.
Yeah, we're going back to 1985. Sorry, it was not funny, but I mean that's how. But that wasn't legislated for. Whereas in immigration, yeah, it is. It's inherently racist.
And how do you think I guess the idea of Britishness as the inside and anything else as the outside, how and why is that constructed? Like how do the borders, I guess, affect the people that you work with, the clients, on a day-to-day basis, even after they've been given status?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I think, a lot of people taking it away from Britishness. So where somebody, because it's a long road to getting a British passport, which most people want to get because for that very reason, even though it costs a fortune to go through, but they want it because it's like, I don't feel safe until I've got that British passport, because there are so many ways to strip. It's like an onion. There are so many ways to strip away status that's been granted. But to be honest with you, things have changed so dramatically over the last 12 years that there was a time when if you got indefinite leave to remain after either through a family connection or an immigration application or as a refugee, there was a kind of element of safety. But sorry, if you got indefinite leave to remain, there wasn't, because there was always a way of taking it away, even for the slightest kind of act of criminality. But nowadays, you can also strip somebody of citizenship in exactly the same way. So actually, citizenship doesn't give you that system. And we know that, I haven't got any clients that this has happened to, but British citizens are having their citizenship taken away when they're not in the country, and that's it. What their recourse to a legal challenge is, unless they happen to have a high profile.
And that's being done illegally in some cases. Recently, I think there was a call for Begum to be to have her citizenship removed. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Home Secretary that called for it, even though he knew that the legal process wasn't. That's not how it worked. Or
the Home Secretary was still arguing that she had dual nationality. I don't think she did. No. And but there are, I'm ashamed to say I haven't looked into it, but Philip Sands is a very revered lawyer, has and says there isn't. And then they brought on a Bangladeshi lawyer who said, there might be, depending when the parents were born. So, but as with a lot of Home Office, high-profile Home Office decisions, they make massive sweeping statements and make a lot of mistakes, and they do it for political reasons.
How much control does the Home Secretary have over the Home Office? Is it a sort of yes minister situation, or do they actually get to change things outside of introducing new immigration policies?
I think the Home Secretary has an enormous amount of power. But I don't know. I don't know about the civil servants and the High Senate and what they have to say. But the hostile environment was Cameron's baby, and Theresa May took the ball and ran, and it's still going. As you know, it's been renamed as the compliant environment.
Compliant environment, not the hostile environment.
No, it's now the compliant, because Sajid Javid didn't like that, but he's renamed it as compliant environment. But nothing has changed. It's the same thing.
And Britain has a proud history of welcoming refugees, according to the Home Office, every time they open their mouth, particularly if it's in connection with a scandal. Do we have a proud history? Is that something anybody would actually say? We have. There is a history. There is some history.
I would say the only time that anybody could really be proud about our history with refugees would probably, and I am talking as a sort of, a hack historian. I am not an expert. But I would say that during the Second World War, we didn't have a proud history. It took Nicholas Winterton to push the Kindertransport. We didn't have a proud history.
And we did sink a boat of refugees, of Jewish refugees during the Second World War prior to the Kindertransport. But so I think that's no is the answer to that question. But I think that's what they mean when they start talking about. I think they mean the handful of children that managed to get in against your initially against your wishes,
and nothing to do with the government. That is what they're proud of. Yeah, I mean, every bit.
It was it was private citizens, and
exactly every bit of legislation from sort of 2004 or 5, I think Aliens Registration Act. I think it was 1904 onwards. Commonwealth Citizens Act. They've all been as a way of stopping people coming in. So first of all, you get the Jewish pogrom in the beginning of the 20th century, sorry, I get my centuries all muddled now. And then you get the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, stopping Ugandan Asians, Kenyan Asians. So, emergency legislation. It's a proud history we have. And then you get the 1981 Nationality Act, saying that all the people that arrived here as citizens of the United Kingdom colonies aren't British anymore. Oh, we've got a new citizenship. British, you're not it. Sorry, mate. Yes, proud.
So for people that believe that the current hostile environment is a beneficial thing, what would you say to them as a professional working very much within, that environment? What's the reality of it?
The reality is it means that it's a funny question to have to answer, because it means somehow I have to. I'm asked to justify it, but I imagine that the justification is that, as we've learned from Compliant, is that people who are here unlawfully shouldn't be here anymore. The reality is that the Home Office is such an incompetent, bureaucratic State Department that they make mistakes constantly. And if you believe in immigration control, and if you believe that people who've overstayed shouldn't be here, then that is presumably the justification for hostile environment.
There are unfortunately a lot of people that do believe, though.
There are, but I'm not here to put their point of view, I hope.
And yet the Home Office maintains a detentionist state of people that are, has people reporting regularly, has people detained, refuses people asylum, allows them to become destitute, withdraws housing, withdraws education, withdraws healthcare from people, in some cases threatens to take people's children away from them if they don't voluntarily sign up to return. And yet it doesn't actually do very much removing of people. When people are refused asylum and when people's appeals are dismissed, there's no immediate steps to then remove that person from the UK, which is the weirdest. Which surely would be the most if they wanted to be tough on immigration and the causes of immigration, wouldn't that not be the place to make people sweat rather than everywhere else and then just not do anything about it?
Yeah, there's some of that's about incompetence, but they do remove people, and they remove people to countries that they can remove them to. And it's the big hidden secret that they don't have relationships with various places for undocumented asylum seekers, and they can't remove them.
So, for example, somewhere like Somalia or Eritrea.
No, they are actually now they charter to Somalia. The Eritreans, on the whole, the majority of Eritreans, if they manage to get here, will actually be recognised as refugees. Not all of them, but the majority of them. But for the good example is Iranians. Undocumented Iranians are not removable at the moment, but they are left in limbo.
So the Home Office is refusing asylum applications from Iranians, as we know. Not all of them, but and then not taking any steps to remove them, but then they couldn't anyway.
Yeah, being unable to remove somebody has never been a reason to let them stay. So, but it hasn't, and there's a lot of legal challenge on that, particularly on it. The only successful challenge in the last however many years I can think of, is on some Iraqi nationals who don't come from the Kurdish Autonomous Area about documentation, but that's very, very specific. And they won't get refugee status, they will just get some form of leave until something changes. So there are a lot of people, and particularly in Brighton, there are a lot of Iranians who've been living a half-life for a long time. They're too frightened to go home. They've got good claims, but they've been refused. And they'd rather stay in half-life, not being able to work, not being able to acquire any kind of accommodation, than return.
Absolutely devastating situation to find yourself in. We have quite a few clients at Refugee Radio that are in that position, and it's beyond limbo. We have limbo. It can be the situation you're in when you're waiting for the Home Office to look at a fresh claim, or they've taken 5 years to look at your initial application. But this is, I don't know what this is, purgatory or something, but the people the unremovables, who are not allowed to be here, but also not going anywhere else, and are not part of, and not allowed to access things. So you're kind of untouchable, segregated, classed.
And there's no recognition of the unremovables.
No.
And the Home Office's argument, I mean, it's awful because I seem to be putting their argument forward a lot. Please, it is not mine. Is that you could, if you really tried, you could get a document. So I've got no parents. My parents have been killed. I've got no family. We don't believe you. We don't believe anything you've said. Therefore, you have got parents. Therefore, you can contact them and get your birth certificate and get documented and go back. That's the answer. Sort of circular, horrendous argument.
And you've been dealing with the Home Office for a long time in this kind of work. What is it? You refer to it as a State Department. Is it a machine, or is it a collection of people in a building doing, having a code of a certain culture of the way they like to do business, or is it actually some kind of malevolent, sentient, demonic force that's manifesting as a bureaucracy, and it's this techno-fascist entity?
It's all of those things. I don't know what it is. It's a broken machine with a very bad, poor culture. I know they take intake graduates to train up to be interviewers and make decisions, and all the ones that have any kind of moral conscience leave very shortly after they've because of this culture of disbelief. They've also, like so many agencies now, the legal aid agencies are saying they're given a certain amount of time to process something, and if you refuse something, it's often quicker than if you allow it. And I don't want. I sound like I'm being an apologist for their decision-making process, but it's the top tier culture, and the culture of disbelief that prevails, sadly.
Oh, the culture of disbelief within the Home Office, is there I remember, perhaps incorrectly, that there was some part of the Geneva Convention or the initial legislation behind all of this, that the assessment of an asylum claim or the interview process, it was supposed to be impartial. I'm sure that somewhere
there's a lot, yes. Yeah. I mean, the UNHCR guidelines talk a lot about how you should look at a claim, and that it's basically on the balance of probabilities, and that the benefit of the doubt should be given to the client, but it so often isn't. Well, and I mean, that's what you get to argue in court, supposedly in front of an independent judge. Well, in front of an independent judge. For the Home Office, become your equal, and you are parties to an argument. But some of the examples of sort of, I have, for example, 14-year-old client interviewed for over 4 hours, is being asked very particularly about the circumstances that led up to their father's assassination, and he could not remember whether or not his father had finished his supper when he got up and left, or whether or not he was halfway through it. So in his statement he said that he thought he'd finished. He didn't say he thought it, he had finished, and when he was interviewed he was asked and he said, I can't remember, I think it was still some food left. That was an example of 4 of those kind of contradictions that led to a refusal, which was then upheld by one of the disallowing judges when this kid was 14. So that's an example of the kind of appalling decision making that goes on.
Because he couldn't remember if his dad had finished eating before he was killed.
Yeah, I mean it wasn't the only reason, but all of the discrepancies were those kind of discrepancies.
What do you think is the culture of the opposition to the Home Office, or the helpers who are making it possible for people to actually navigate the Home Office? We've spoken about the restrictions of the legal aid having gone up by £1, I think it was, in 30 years.
Yeah.
Per hour.
It went up a bit more than that, then went down again.
And the various the restrictions with every new Immigration Act. Do you have a sense of the culture of the people who are helping refugees and asylum seekers, or asylum seekers to become refugees?
I can't. No, actually, I'm sorry, I've gone blank on that. Give me some ideas.
Are we all white knights, paternalistic crusaders? Are we God-bothering do-gooders? Are we anti-state activists? Sorry?
Are we fighting the same battle?
I would say on the whole, yeah, but I would think all of those descriptions were true. You know, we're a collection of direct activists, rather kind of conventional people like me who kind of use the law and often feel that I would like to do a lot more direct action but don't. There's extraordinarily, as a lifelong non-believer, there are some quite, we look to some religious organisations who are actually some of the few people that are positive in these areas. So yeah, I think we're a big collection of some of us are well-meaning do-gooders, and some of us, but even if we are, it's better than nothing.
And the hostile environment, or the cooperative environment?
Compliant.
So what environment are we? We're resisting the hostile environment, presumably. What's our environment? The lovely environment? Do we have what's our vision of the environment? What should the environment be?
I'm assuming, I don't know, you're asking me a lot of questions which kind of revolve around justifying. I'm finding it difficult because it sounds like, I'm talking on behalf of the compliant environment, and I don't like to think of myself as being any part of it. But yeah, I think we are a very divided nation for all sorts of reasons, and you were talking earlier on about Brexit. And I don't think anything has particularly changed, but what has happened is that this has been taken off a lot of rather violent racist thought. People are feeling quite justified.
The zip on the mouth.
Yeah, saying what they've been feeling for a very long time. And that goes across the generations and across the classes and across everything. And it's very unpleasant. I suppose, when I first started working in this area, we had the kind of the joys of the 1970s and 1980s. I think happily of the GLC, Ken Livingstone before he went mad.
For me, there was a bit before Brexit, after the Mediterranean refugee crisis and the public reaction to the death of Alan Kurdi. I found suddenly refugees became popular, and my personal sense had been that they'd been this scapegoated, vilified tabloid hate week figure. And then suddenly there were loads of people getting in contact with me to say they're going to Calais, and loads of new refugee organisations springing up across Brighton. I still can't cope with that.
I do, and I completely agree with you, but I don't, and I had the same feeling, and which was an awful feeling to sort of feel the sense of positivity about this total disaster. Yeah. But I think basically what Alan Curley did and the publicity around it was to kind of motivate a lot of people who felt sympathetic. And suddenly become sympathetic, I don't think, because of that little boy and the image of that child in the sea. I think there were a lot of people around, but they didn't know what to do. And as you know, a lot of people are saying, "What can we do?" And quite a lot of the time, you're not really able to tell them what they can do, because you can't suddenly take in. Well, you might be able to offer accommodation to adults, but you certainly can't offer accommodation to kids unless you go through the proper systems. So I think, that was very hopeful, but it didn't last very long. Those people are still there, they haven't gone away, those people who want to, who've stuck their head above the parapet, but the positivity for the very short amount of positive press time, which was what was so extraordinary, wasn't it? The media was suddenly positive, and it didn't last. It took cues of Bulgaria, and suddenly, and that was the end of that. I think we probably had 3 or 4 months of not even positive, but just not massively negative press. I agree with you.
So we've spoken quite a bit about the challenges and the obstacles faced in this line of work. What are the more the rewarding aspects for you that keep you going? What keeps me going now, with kind of old age, all the cuts, worst work, law getting worse all the time, on the horizon, maybe the Human Rights Act being repealed. What keeps me going are the clients, and it sounds corny, but it is on the whole a privilege to meet these young people or old people and hear what's happened to them. And when it's positive, it's a privilege to actually be able to be help them to be successful. But that doesn't last very long. Once somebody's recognised as a refugee, all sorts of problems hit them. It's not suddenly kind of life is wonderful and all the accommodation becomes a problem. Often people who've been staving off a collapse will have a total breakdown and collapse once that pressure's off. So I'm not for one moment saying that once my client's application has been successful, life is great, but it's just a tiny step, and that's what keeps me going.